Hello and welcome to the Recruit Rockstars podcast, where we focus on the people part of your business. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I interview a world-class expert on talent and recruiting so that you can build a company filled with rock stars. Today's guest has a very unique angle on building organizations and building teams because he's doing it within the context of, and I hope this is your company, fast growth companies. I mean, hyper growth companies. Companies that are growing at lightning speed, and they have a unique challenge when it comes to building their organization because you got to fill those seats, you got to get people on board, and at the same time, you got a business to run, and that's a recipe for disaster and making a lot of hiring mistakes. And so over the next 20 minutes, we're going to talk with Chris Yeh, who is an expert on this topic. I'll tell you briefly about Chris. He's been in and around Silicon Valley for a couple decades. After Harvard Business School, became a venture capitalist, an operating guy. He's seen this angle from all points of view, then transitioned to becoming a best-selling author. If that wasn't enough, he wrote a phenomenal book, one of my favorites, The Alliance, and now recently released a book with Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, and they are the two co-authors of Blitzscaling, the lightning-fast path to building massively valuable companies. And that's what I want for your company, to become massively valuable. So with all that said, Chris Yeh, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Jeff. It is a pleasure.
I'm thrilled to have you, and I have a million questions, but we're going to do it in about 20 minutes. So why don't we start? Well, let's start at the 50,000-foot view. What is a massively valuable company and kind of hyper growth? How do you define it? How do we know when we see that? And importantly, how do I know if my company should be one of those, or if I should say, screw the whole unicorn path, I should just focus on building a lifestyle business and profitable and have 10 people and do it that way? I'm sure it's not right for everybody.
Absolutely. And this is one of the misconceptions we try to clear up. We think that blitzscaling is a really powerful tool if you're trying to build a multi-billion-dollar company and if you're trying to do it in record time. But whether or not you can blitzscale a company depends a lot on the market conditions. So the way we describe it is blitzscaling is the right strategy when you're attacking a winner-take-most or winner-take-all market.
It's a land grab market, and if I'm not first or close to first, I don't have a chance.
As you know, you probably remember the old movie Glengarry Glen Ross.
Sure.
First prize, Cadillac Eldorado. Second prize, steak knives. Third prize, you're fired.
Yeah.
These winner-take-all and winner-take-most markets are Glengarry Glen Ross markets.
So these would be social networks, network effects industries. What other examples come to mind?
So obviously network effects definitely apply. That's the primary source today. Yep. But sometimes it happens outside the tech industry. So for example, one of the companies we talk about in the book is Chesapeake Energy and the shale oil and gas boom. There, the vector of winner take most or winner take all is the fact that the mineral rights are leased on 99-year leases. So once you get all the mineral rights leased, that's it, game over.
You're done. And I suppose it could work in a small town. If I start the first pizza joint in town and I want to scale that thing to be the pizza joint in town and keep everyone else out, I better get it right from the very beginning, right?
Yeah, and customer loyalty is definitely one of those things that can cause a land grab effect where people were very sticky over time. Of course, if you're building out and blitzscaling in a 100,000 person town, you should not raise $1 billion. You should raise a smaller amount of money.
Sure. It's all proportionate. And hopefully not raise money at all if you can get away with it.
If possible.
Good. So now we've defined it, blitzscaling. Well, what is the origin of that word? Obviously, the listeners know what scaling is. Why blitz?
So we really took it from the word blitzkrieg from World War II history.
Sure.
And of course, this is very controversial. We actually went around a number of times saying, do we really want to use this term? Because there's a lot of things associated with blitzkrieg.
There's a lot of baggage with it. Yeah.
Very bad stuff.
Yeah.
But in the end, it was the best description. The blitz, and everyone knows what blitz means. It's this all-out effort. It's very rapid. It's very sudden. It's very aggressive. And so blitz scaling was the thing that just best captured the essence of what we were talking about.
I love it. I get it. So there's a number of components to it. I'm sure for the listeners, there's building scalable operations, repeatable processes. There's raising the right capital, to your point. I really would love to focus on the people part of blitzscaling. What does that look like? What are some of the big mistakes or at least big considerations when it comes to building that kind of organization?
Well, the thing you have to remember about a blitzscaling company is the incredible speed with which it's growing. I often use the example of Amazon during its early days. And during the period of 1996 to 1999, Amazon grew the size of its organization by over 50x.
Hmm.
So that's incredible
The sheer
growth for a
head
very
count,
short.
the head count.
Exactly, sheer headcount.
Yep.
That was going, I think, up to something like 7,000 employees.
Yep.
And when you grow that quickly, so many of the things that we're used to doing from a hiring perspective just don't work. And if you start to think about it, a lot of the things that we do around the culture and management of a company don't work. Normally, if a company's growing 10% a year, you can assume that people will learn from the existing employees, hey, here's how we do it around here.
Yeah.
Well, guess what?
There's no
If you're
time for that in a
There's no
hyper-growth.
time for that. You're growing 10x year over year. By the
Yeah.
time the end of the year comes, 90% of the people are new people.
Right. Right. And so training, development, filling your pipeline, filling the sourcing of, if you need to hire 1,000 people, you need to talk to tens of thousands of candidates.
Exactly. And that's where I would say there are two important things to keep in mind. The first is that's a huge source of potential trouble. And what I mean is this: I think everyone's heard about some of the issues that Silicon Valley has had with diversity.
Sure. Sure.
It's not like these founders said, you know what, I want to create a very unwelcoming environment.
Yeah.
What they did is they were just trying to grow as fast as possible.
Right.
So they said, okay, everyone, go out and hire your friends.
Yep.
And so
Take what you can get.
exactly, you take what you can get. And if
Yep.
you're always hiring people who are friends of your existing employees,
Right.
they're going to tend to look like your existing employees. And before you know it, you've set the company down a path away from diversity.
So let's set aside recruiting, diversity, things like that for a minute. Let's talk about once you get lucky enough to get these people on board at the pace that you're describing. It strikes me that building a healthy, vibrant culture just takes time. It's like a Jell-O. It has to set a certain amount of time before the Jell-O just kind of falls apart. How do you build a healthy, vibrant culture when you're growing 10x per year? Is it even possible? I mean, Amazon has a culture. It's not, from what studies show, it's not the right place for everybody to work. It's not an easy place to work, but they certainly have defined what the DNA looks like and what they should be going after. Other companies, Tesla comes to mind, have really had a lot of trouble, with turnover, with culture, with DNA. How do you handle that piece of it? And then we'll talk about recruiting in a minute.
Absolutely. So the culture is really important because if you think about it, culture is the way that you as a leader are able to affect people's decisions and affect people's actions when you're not in the room.
Sure.
People who try to control everything top down with a bunch of rules, that just isn't going to work. And
Demand and control falls apart if you're trying to scale fast.
Exactly. So culture is the solution to that. So there's a couple of elements. There's the challenges as you described, because you're bringing in so many new people. How do you inculcate the new culture into them? And moreover, just the sheer size of the company as it grows from 10 to 100 to 1,000 changes radically the kinds of communications that you have. So we saw a number of interesting patterns in the companies that were able to build strong cultures. One of the most interesting little factoids that came out of this is that a surprising number of companies had the founders involved in the hiring of every employee through the 500th employee.
So let me be clear, because this is a huge thing. For the first 500, I, the founder, interviewed every finalist, every person that got the job.
That's right.
And the goal being to make sure that DNA didn't get diluted over time, or what was it?
Yeah, I think that's what it was. And we talked to a number of different founders who said this. So this was true at Google, this was true at Workday, and this was also true at Airbnb. All three of these companies, the founders told us that 500 number, unprompted. And my speculation is this. There are two things that go into it. The first is something that Anil Busri, who is the co-founder of Workday, said. Anil Busri, very successful guy, helped start PeopleSoft. And what he said was, when Dave Duffield, his co-founder, when Dave Duffield and I were interviewing people, we said to ourselves, we're not just interviewing and making a decision on this person. We're also making a decision on the 100 other people this person is going to hire over their career at Workday.
Yeah, that's
they took
great.
it really seriously.
Huge. The implications are mind-numbing.
The second element of it is that I think that bottom line, early on, you don't have time to do all this work to carefully codify your culture into some sort of giant handbook.
Yeah.
It really is based on that personal touch. And the reason you have to stop at 500 and just can't keep going is by that point in time, you're growing so quickly. If you're the founder or CEO, you're spending your entire day
Yeah.
doing nothing but interviewing.
Yeah.
And
It's
that
just a limit of literally hours in your day.
Exactly.
Got it. 500, the first 500 people. That's staggering because, presumably that means you're interviewing, you have some attrition. Mm-hmm. So you could be interviewing a factor more than that per year.
Exactly. And of course, you're not necessarily going to hire every single person that you interview. And then, of course, once you get past that point, you have to introduce other things. So Amazon, you mentioned, a very strong culture. They have this notion of bar raisers, which is to make sure that we are only hiring people who are raising the bar. Airbnb, very strong culture, has the notion of culture interviews, where someone comes in and they interview the person to see if they are a good fit with the culture. Notice, when I say fit with the culture, it doesn't mean they exactly match up with the culture, but it means that what they bring to the table will work with the culture and hopefully add to it and make it
compatible, at least, if not culture additive.
Exactly. And the final thing I'll say is just, I think it's very important from a cultural perspective, you have to have a strong culture if you want to succeed. In fact, we like to say that you can have a bad culture that's a strong culture and still succeed. It's harder.
But you have a culture.
But you have a culture.
Right.
People have to know how we do things around
what's expected, what's permitted, etc.
Exactly. So it's more dangerous to have a weak culture than it is to have a bad culture. Although, of course, the best thing is to have a good, strong, positive culture.
And without getting too touchy-feely, what does that look like? What is a good, quote-unquote, culture? Were there common characteristics of these successful companies?
Yes. So the common characteristics are they have a baseline of how people relate to each other and treat each other. So for me, it would be treating everyone with respect.
Golden rule.
Golden rule. Now, again, it can differ from place to place in terms of what constitutes respect. One of the companies that we talk a lot about is PayPal, where Reed was, of course, one of the founding board members and early executives. And it had a very strong culture that said that people should confront each other directly, much like Ray Dalio at Bridgewater. That's not for everyone, but it can absolutely be part of a strong and good culture, provided that confrontation is done in a way that makes people still feel comfortable.
What did you observe from these companies that you studied, Chris, about how to assess a candidate for a position, regardless of what the position is? If the company's growing at 10x per year, the company, the department, the role, everything is going to look totally different a year from now. How do I understand how to interview a candidate for today? How do I possibly assess them for 10x? And that's just 1 year.
Right. So the first thing, of course, is the most important thing is to hire the person for today. And in our book, we call it hire Ms. Right Now, not Ms. Right, because the most important thing is to maintain your lead over your competitors, to get from one stage to the next. And you just have to get the best people on the bus to get you from point A to point B. And hopefully they get you to point C. But we do set the expectation. In a blitzscaling situation, it's not uncommon for every order of magnitude of growth to replace over 50% of the management team.
Let's slow down, because if the company's growing at 10x, that's an order of magnitude. You're saying you might have, like certain presidents of the United States, a high level of turnover on an annual basis.
Now, what we hope for that is not that you necessarily turn over and turn out all the people, in the President of the United States, but rather you are just continually bringing in, instead of the VP of sales who's great at getting you to 10 million, you bring in the one who's great at getting you to 100 million and to $1 billion. And hopefully not all of the employees depart. This is one of the messages of the Alliance, which is, hopefully people continue to find different missions within the same company or to maintain a great relationship with the company afterwards. But the realistic fact is it's hard to find someone who's great at 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 100, and all of those different phases.
So it takes a very honest approach to have that discussion with that person who is Peter principled out to say, look, John, Sally, you got us from here to there. You're not going to get us from there to the next step, but we don't want you to go. And you have to try to find a home for them. Now, their ego may not allow that. Or in today's competitive job market, the reality is if they got you from here to there, someone else wants them, right?
Exactly. And that's one of the things that has actually allowed Silicon Valley to grow so many companies so quickly, because of the fact that it is accepted for the talent to be recycled. So that great VP of sales who can get a company from $10 million to $100 million in sales,
Yeah.
they do it for one company, then they go to the next company, and then they go to the next company. And in many ways, it's actually very good for the individual employees as well, because they're building up a portfolio of bets along the way.
So this is interesting, because I think most people, certainly myself, and I teach this in my class at Kellogg, turnover, you shouldn't have a lot of turnover. Retention certainly important. You got to measure employee turnover. What you're kind of saying is in hypergrowth situations, that may not be a great metric.
Yeah, exactly. In hypergrowth situations, a high turnover rate may in fact be a sign of health rather than a sign of problems or weakness.
Interesting. Are there any other counterintuitive things that you found along the way when it comes to hiring, recruiting, retention that would be very unique for blitzscaling companies versus, regular growth, let's say, companies?
I think that one of the messages that we also have out there is that there are different times when you want to hire generalists versus specialists.
Yeah.
And the key difference is the flexibility and adaptability. Early on in the growth of a company or a particular initiative, when there's so much uncertainty, you want generalists who can rapidly adapt and pivot on the fly.
Yeah.
But later, as you're attempting to really operationalize something that you already have built to a certain level, you're really going to look for specialists, people who have the specific knowledge to do one or two things really, really well.
Did you find a certain number of employees or revenue or something where that pivot starts to happen?
We found that it generally happened between the 100 to 1,000 employee mark.
Got it. So not that far off what we discussed earlier with 500 people.
That's right. And this is one of the reasons why it's often a challenge for founders to go through this transition, because they've been very used to a situation in which they have a personal relationship with all those employees. They interviewed all of them.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, it's going beyond that. But in order to have the impact you want as a founder, you have to accept that change is necessary to support growth.
What happens when, in most cases, these blitzscaling companies, I'm getting used to using that word, Facebook, Google, it's a pretty short list where it's a straight line up. When the shit hits the fan, and you go from 10x growth to, God forbid, 5x growth or 1x growth or whatever, what then? It would seem like people are going to be totally demotivated. They're going to be like, oh boy, this is not what I signed up for. This is not going to work. How do you prevent the rats, quote unquote, from fleeing your ship?
And that is a great question, because people have this image of their minds of even a company like Facebook going straight up and to the right. But even Facebook has gone through cycles where its growth dramatically diminished, even early on in its history. And so there are several things that we'll tell people. The first is you have to have an eagle eye on the metrics to foresee when you're coming to the end of a growth period. Blitzscaling is not something you can do forever.
It's not infinite, otherwise you'll take over the world.
Exactly, or the entire universe.
Yeah, right.
That was my joke about Microsoft.
Right.
I said Microsoft can't grow at its current rate forever because it's going to need extraterrestrial customers.
Yeah, right.
And so if you look at that, then a big part of it is recognizing in advance when is the time to take your foot off the gas instead of driving off the cliff.
And does that look like hiring at a slower pace? What do you do?
Absolutely. So let me give you an example. Twitter is a company where you could look at the user growth of Twitter and see that at a certain point, that user growth essentially flatlined, and it became a stable number of Twitter users. Now, Twitter kept hiring after that. They added hundreds and hundreds of more employees after that point. Why? Because the revenue was still growing. And so they said, well, we need the people to handle the revenue. But really, if they had been looking carefully at the growth metrics, they would have realized we have exited the blitzscaling phase, and now we need to do things differently. The other thing is, I would say that when you are thinking about blitzscaling your company, each new product, each new initiative is an S curve. Every product is an S-curve.
You need to look at it by division, by department, by product, not just the total company.
Exactly.
Or maybe redeploy within your company resources.
Precisely. If we look at Apple, one of the world's most valuable companies, it has written a series of S-curves, the Apple II, the Macintosh, the iPod, the iPhone. And each time you have to develop a new S-curve to keep going. If Apple were just a Mac company, it would be a tiny fraction of its current size.
Right. Services are next, they say, right?
That's the hope. We'll see.
And so that may take a whole new set of skill sets, competencies, same DNA. If they can find those people internally and redeploy them, great. Otherwise, they're going to need to accelerate their hiring and potentially fund it by parting ways with other people.
And a great example of this is Netflix. So Netflix is a company that grew in its early days by sending DVDs and Blu-rays by mail.
Yeah.
Guess what? That's not what they do anymore. So for a time, they had some of the world's greatest experts on the logistics of sending
distribution,
DVDs by
right?
mail.
Right.
Those people and their skills are no longer needed. They're no longer with the company. Now they got rich along the way, and they are moved on to other roles where they have the ability to deploy those skills again. But the fact is, if the business changes, it may be that you will need to change folks, which is why having a relationship like the Alliance, where it's very open, where it's something where people really discuss these possibilities in advance, is so important. So people don't feel like they've been betrayed. Blindsided by
I did great for 3 years, and now all of a sudden you're telling me that my ability to run warehouses is no longer needed here.
Yeah. It should not be a surprise to the person. You should be talking about it all along. Hey, look, this is where this is going, and let's figure out if there's something else you want to do in the company when that time comes, or if you think it's better to do something somewhere else.
Most managers don't want to have those discussions.
No, they don't, and that's why we still need people to read The Alliance.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal book. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Look, Chris, this is it's a pretty heady concept, right? Because I think a lot of listeners would think, God, if I was lucky enough to be in that category, everything would take care of itself. I'd hire experts. We could figure it out. From what you're saying, pretty hard to figure out. It's just a different set of problems.
Absolutely. And the other thing I would say, because I'm sure a lot of the listeners, a lot of the CEOs out there are saying, well, I'm not growing 10x a year or even 1x a year, or even 2x a year. The answer is, with blitzscaling, you can still look at it as a source of inspiration for different ways to move your company faster.
Yeah.
No matter what growth rate you're at, being able to grow faster than your competitors can still be a major competitive advantage depending on the circumstances. You can find a lot of different ideas on hacks and how to grow faster in the book Blitzscaling.
Certainly around being nimble and flexible and versatile. So this is not a book just for people that are leading teams or organizations at hypergrowth companies. If you aspire to that, if you want to learn from that experience, you've got to pick up a copy of Blitzscaling, the lightning fast path to building massively valuable companies. Not just valuable, but massively valuable. Chris, how can people get a copy of the book, although I think I know your answer, and how can people get in touch with you and learn more?
Excellent question. So you can go find all the different places you can buy Blitzscaling at blitzscaling.com. I generally direct people to Amazon, but of course, because we're writers, we have to provide links to all the different retailers. Otherwise, they get upset.
There you go.
Please go to blitzscaling.com. We also have a newsletter that you can sign up for there. If you are interested in diving deeper into the ideas of blitzscaling, Reed and I have a podcast series within the Greylock Partners podcast. It's called Grey Matter, Grey Matter.
Yep.
And we do a long series diving into the details of how you actually blitzscale. And then finally, if you are trying to figure out, well, how can I make blitzscaling work at my company? I also have set up the Global Scaling Academy at globalscalingacademy.com, where you can go to learn about courses, workshops, all sorts of different ways to bring blitzscaling alive in your organization.
I love it. There's no shortage of resources, so make sure you tap into them. And again, if you aspire to that kind of growth, you got to learn and prepare for that kind of growth. It just doesn't happen. Chris Yeh, thank you so much for making the time. We really appreciate you making time and being on the show.
Jeff, huge pleasure. I'll come back anytime.